Thank you very much, and in welcoming my colleagues, also thank you, and I'd like to welcome all of you. I'm going to provide just a little bit of background about these people who have quite generally become personal friends over the last couple of years. And in doing this, we don't have time for me in any way to give justice to what their real backgrounds. But if I start with Deborah Roberts, who is the founder and head of the Environmental Planning and Climate Protection Department for I always get the pronunciation, but it's Etiquini municipality in Durban. But perhaps more notably, the international perspective, is the co-chair for the 6th International Panel on Climate Change Progress Report. And Deborah, amongst many other things, was worked on an advisor to the Rockefeller Foundation's Asian Cities Climate Change and Resilience Network, which is one of sort of the precursors to what is now the 100 Resilient Cities Network. Now, in terms of the actual presentation, it'll be delivered by Joe Dowes from Durban, and Joe is the manager for the Strategic Environmental Integration and Resilience branch. Moving from Durban to Boulder, Greg Guibert also worked with ACERN when he was at the Institute for Social and Environmental Transitions, before moving from there to the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and now CRO with the City of Boulder. Pat Pernomo from Semarang is currently the coordinator of the Semarang Working Group for ACERN. You'll develop a bit of a theme around this. And was in 2014 appointed as Secretary of the Development and Planning Board for Semarang, and has recently been promoted to the Deputy Director of Capital Investment, really thinking about how resilience and financing needs to be aligned within a city. So I would be feeling right now either sort of somehow a bit inadequate or just generally left out that I've never worked with ACERN. But I'm in good company, because I think for all Jeff's international connections, Jeff Hebert from New Orleans also has not. Jeff, when I met Jeff in 2014, he was the Executive Director for the New Orleans Reconstruction Authority, and prior to that had worked with the state of Louisiana on the reconstruction post Hurricane Katrina. Jeff is now the first deputy mayor and the chief administrative officer for New Orleans, so has really built on that, as Councillor Wood said, to kind of really make this a fundamental role within the city. Now, it is an absolute privilege to welcome them, to do so considering them as friends, but our role as people who really do have, as I say, I'm very proud to say, some really deep personal friendships that have developed, is to translate what are personal and professional connections into knowledge and value for our respective cities, and that's what we're looking to do here over the coming few days. Now, in doing that, we are absolutely helped by others in the room, so all of the CROs are accompanied by academics, as well as their teams and so forth, and so I would also acknowledge those. Professor Dave Kendall from the University of Melbourne is helping the Melbourne team, but he's also then supported more broadly by people such as Rodney Vandery, David Callow, and others from the City of Melbourne's Urban Sustainability team. And we have Lars Kuhnen as well, who is very proud. He is, for the past 2.5 weeks, has been the inaugural City of Melbourne Chair in Resilient Cities at the University of Melbourne. And Lars is here to sort of build both specifically on this work, but also more broadly to put academic rigor to Melbourne's work in the resilience space. Equally, and this has been touched on, but this is a metropolitan effort, and so there are some here today, and there will be others as we go, from metropolitan councils. I'd particularly like to call out people from Banyule, Brimbank, and Wyndham, whose municipalities we're visiting on our site tours tomorrow. So, if I've left anyone out, I do apologise. But in the interest of getting to actually the bit that, as Councillor Oak said, talking about what does this mean in cities. And I'm also very mindful that there are any number of people in this room who are actually deeper experts in biodiversity than me, but nonetheless, let me give you sort of the generalist's view of quite a specialized area. And I guess as CROs, for many of us, that's really what we do, is about how well we can get across a range of issues to bring them together. In doing this, I would like to extend my own personal respects to the traditional owners of the land, the peoples of the Kulin Nation, who, and I know this has been said before, but there has to be something phenomenally profound about people who have managed to thrive within what can be a very harsh environment for over 30,000 years. And I'll just mention quickly, so Tim Flannery, one of our leading climate and also natural or biodiversity experts, has written a book called The Birth of Melbourne. Well, actually, he kind of edited a book, but it's lots of other people's writing. But anyway, but it's very good. But one of the, we talk about sort of naturally the land-based stuff, but actually one of the quotations he has in there, one of the early European settlers, was that the bay was so rich in fish, sharks, and whales that you could have walked across their backs to reach the shore. And that certainly is not what we have when we look out at the bay today. What we do have in Melbourne is 10,000 square kilometres of land managed by 32 municipalities. And I would posit, again, with the qualifications that I've given about my own limitations in this space, but I would posit that we have two enduring dichotomies in Melbourne, which again are not unusual elsewhere. So firstly, urban growth versus conservation, and secondly, native v exotic species, be that flora or fauna. And I think that in terms of drivers of biodiversity loss here, again, there will be overlaps, it's about habitat loss, human population growth, climate change, cultural change, and governance decisions. And without being too mechanistic about it, I will try to cover on all of those things. So Melbourne sits at the confluence of 6 bioregions, and I think that's, again, for all that scale, the fact that we've got 6 distinct bioregions really talks to, on the one hand, the richness of our environment, but also the fragility, as that has all sort of evolved over very specific contexts. And obviously, again, this will probably be the last thing I say on climate change, because it is such a thing for all of us. But again, with that level of fragility, it doesn't take a lot of shift in climate to really put things under stress. And that is why we as Councillor Wood said, have one of the reasons, among others, for our highest rate of species loss. So to put that into context, essentially what we've got is, well, despite the bioregions, I know this is 3, but essentially you have in the west, have traditionally had flat volcanic plains in the west covered in grasslands. In the central and southern regions, low elevation and coastal alluvial plains. And within that, extensive beach ridges, which have then created swamps. Now, which again, great for biodiversity, not so handy if you're building a house. So we've, as in other places around the world, have largely drained those swamps in the interest for agricultural, commercial, or residential purposes. Just quickly, just to sort of touching on the native versus exotic piece. So the taxonomy of flora suggests, I think, identified 1,864 different types of plant species, of which 178 are under severe threat of extinction. So about 1 in 10 of our plants. And in the fauna is 520 species identified, of which 136 are at risk of extinction. So 1 in 3 in that sense. And it's interesting, again, from this native versus exotic perspective. So a taxa of streetscapes identified 1,100 species, of which only 76 were indigenous. Now, one of the things that will come out, people will have a very diverse range of views as to what is the right way to conserve and what kind of nature needs to be. But certainly in a changing climate, and again, there has been good work around this, but how landing on a place in which we know, in a sense, reach a conclusion, while there will always be an element of debate about what is the right way to move forwards, I think is an important part. And I think it's particularly instructive from a local government perspective that in so many councils you have a parks department and then a bush restoration or a land care department. And so until those are brought together, we will never, I think is a very significant indicator of the disconnect that exists in many cases. Now, Melbourne, from a biodiversity and sort of land use perspective, has been a combination of both planned and accidental. And so you see this is sort of quite you can see this in many parts of the city, this sort of configuration, parks, open space, tree-lined streets. And for a long period of time, that kind of happenstance was probably manageable from a natural perspective. But we're now at 4.5 million people, and that's creaking, to say the least. And as we go out to about 7.5, maybe even up to 8 by around 2050, so over the next 30 years, on the current trajectory, there is no way that we can be a thriving city continuing to exist in that way. Now, from a governance perspective, we have national parks within our metropolitan area. The national parks are federally regulated, but they're managed by the state. Now, then you have local parks and streetscapes, which then fall under the purview of local government. How well these connect is a critical determinant of how well we kind of literally begin to grow our cities in terms of, I think, growing nature back into our cities. In the 1970s, we had green wedges introduced, which was meant to protect more of the city, but these have been approached upon over time for a combination of economic rationale and political expediency. And similarly with the urban growth boundaries that were introduced now a generation ago, which again people have gone like, oh well, the city keeps growing, so we better move those boundaries. And so, well, no, because that's why they were there. But anyway, and so at the same time, and really sort of thinking from this sort of deep resilience perspective, we've got other challenges. So particularly in the peri-urban areas, where we clear native vegetation as a fire management issue. Now, so what's the right thing from again, from a resilience perspective? Do you go, okay, well, we care too much about biodiversity, so don't clear that area of shame about the fire. So somewhere there will always be these balances and trade-offs that we have to build in, and I think that's the profound role of the chief resilience officers, and hopefully what part of this work is about. Now, the cultural bit is also, so again, this will mean more to some than others, but the kind of classic thing in moving to Melbourne or moving to Australia was the quarter-acre block. That was what people aspire towards. You build out your house on the quarter-acre block. Now, you got to do your this is a test of your mental agility. You've got to switch from imperial now to metric. So in parts of Melbourne, so essentially that quarter-acre block was around just about 750 square kilometers, square meters, give or take. So in 1994, that was still the average plot size. By 2003, so quite a rapid shift, that has fallen to 570 square meters. Now, one of the interesting things about that is not only then, so this is what we used to have, and you can just, so they're not great photos, but you can see sort of quite a bit of greenness, basically, and less there. So not only are the plot sizes shrinking, but actually the average floor size or house size has expanded by 36%. So a third larger on a smaller bit, so there's just less space for nature. So what we're seeing is thus the pressure moving in many ways from the private realm, where a lot of biodiversity was provided within the private realm, to really having to be picked up by the public sector and those in the public realm. But again, this is where the cultural bit comes in, because at some point, if people, broadly speaking, if citizens don't value the nature, then why are they paying their taxes to have it maintained and so forth? And that's why out in the West, where we'll be tomorrow, in fact, it's one of Dave Kendall and colleagues' papers that I've drawn this particular quote from, that is, in the Western temperate, native grassland is nearing total destruction. And again, and that's where essentially the East, Melbourne was all developed in the East. We are now shifting that development to the West. So profound. Hopefully this is making a bit of a case for why in the resilience strategy, one of our long-term objectives to enable stronger natural assets and ecosystems alongside a growing population. Now, there are, for all the sort of the trajectory and so forth, there are reasons for optimism. I mean, some of the work being done by councils like Brimbank and Banyule, Yarra Ranges has a fabulous, that is driving a project with 9 traditional owner groups to look at how we can better use fire in a way that they have now discovered used to be, we burn at a different time to what the traditional owners did as a fire protection management, which has profound consequences. Again, a lot of work still to be done on that, but the fact that it's being undertaken is important. Plan Melbourne, which was the next 30-year strategy, except if by the time it's actually released, we might have got to the 30 years. But anyway, facetiousness aside, we do expect it will have stronger protection of green infrastructure, or sorry, of green space and nature. The reason I slipped into mentioning infrastructure there is because Infrastructure Victoria has just released a strategy where they're very clear about the need to use green infrastructure going forwards. And so, you know, as I say, grounds for optimism, but a tremendous way to go. Our metropolitan urban forest, Nature Conservancy has already been called out. But for us, and just to be really clear about this, it's not about just tree planting. The reason we refer to the urban forest is it is about the qualities of a forest. It is about using nature to provide for cooling, for cleaner air, for water retention in soil quality, and in this context, fundamentally biodiversity. So that is a bit of a canter through Melbourne. I absolutely look forward to building on this with both international colleagues and colleagues locally. I guess in concluding, I essentially would argue that there are, in terms of biodiversity outcomes in Melbourne, we have to make the success of our biodiversity depends on the decisions made in the following 4 areas. So habitat management in established areas, urban growth and how we manage that, especially on the fringe in the interface councils, the peri-urban, the management of green assets, including better using nature for infrastructure services, and the promotion of biodiversity on private land. And on that, I'm going to hand over. This is a bit of what in the US you would call a head fake, so I'm going to look towards Deborah, but Joe Dow is going to come up to talk to Durban's point.